All right, so a little bit of kind of context here. So we're looking at two photos of the new Colgate Powerhouse, those kind of larger cylinders there that you see. I've got arrows pointing to them. Those are the actual housings for the power generation, for the turbines that spin to generate electricity. And you can kind of see the before on the left there and the after on the right. So when we talk about the flooding, the disaster, the landslide, these photos give you context.
How big are those? Are those like 40 feet in diameter or bigger?
Probably bigger because the pipe's 14.
Yeah, the pipe is, so the pipe is about 14 feet in diameter. So yeah, I think probably between 30 and 60 is about right.
Is that the pipe coming down the hill?
That's the pipe coming down the hill, yeah. And we'll talk about all of this. So in general, the way this is going to work is I'm going to talk a little bit, I'm going to zoom out to the watershed and talk about kind of the Yuba watershed plumbing in general and how it relates to the Feather and the Bear. Then we're going to kind of zoom in on New Colgate. I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about what happened specifically in this case. SYRCL's response, agency response are kind of long-term monitoring, thoughts, strategies, ideas, and then some of the knowns, unknowns, questions moving forward. And then we'll turn it over to myself, but Alicia was out a bunch and was really instrumental in a lot of the water quality monitoring, our science director, and then Danielle as well was out and caught up the fish stranding and fish kill event. She manages all of our lower Yuba salmon restoration projects. So make sure that there's questions and opportunities for both of them. But to start with, let's refresh and kind of think about Yuba plumbing in general. Generally speaking, in terms of the volume of water moved between watersheds, the Yuba is generally credited with being the most complex in the western US, which gives it a very strong claim to the title of a most complicated hydrology and water delivery system in the world. So yay for us, I suppose. A couple of definitions. That TAF is thousands of acre feet. An acre foot is an acre of land 1 foot deep. We'll also see, and I will refer to CFS, or cubic feet per second. That's a volume of discharge, so a volume of water moving past a point over a given time. And discharge is sort of a general term. So starting with this half, this is the NID bubble. Everything in here is owned and operated by NID. You can see we take water from the middle Yuba through a mountain into the South Yuba, through another mountain, into Canyon Creek, through another mountain, then into the South Yuba. A bunch of that water, 396,000 acre feet, ends up in the Bear River watershed, and a little bit, about 56,000 acre feet, ends up back in the South Yuba River. As it relates to the Bear River, it's kind of interesting to note that the natural annual runoff of the Bear River watershed is about 400,000 acre feet. And so between the middle and the middle Yuba, Canyon Creek, and South Yuba, we're just about doubling the amount of water that would naturally be in that watershed. This is the Yuba Water Agency portion. Again, more water coming out of the middle Yuba into New Bullard's Bar Reservoir there. And you can see New Colgate there, a huge water diversion out of New Bullard's Bar. That water then drops back into the Yuba River at the New Colgate Powerhouse, or through the New Colgate Powerhouse. From a naming convention standpoint, the North Yuba and the Middle Yuba come together there just downstream, a couple of miles downstream of New Bullard's Bar. When those two merge, it becomes the Yuba River, and it is the Yuba, and then the South Yuba meets the Yuba. No forks of the Yuba. The Yuba River passes through Englebright Reservoir down much lower, and then from there into the lower Yuba, and then we lose a bunch more water at the Daguerre Point Dam for irrigation north and south of the Yuba. So that's kind of broadly the plumbing. As it relates to flood control, the only true flood control structure in the entire watershed is New Bullard's Bar Dam. Englebright Dam offers zero flood control protection. Without passing judgment, it is a point of fact that the flood capacity at New Ballards Bar Dam is about 8% of the actual watershed runoff. And I will let you all extrapolate the value in terms of flood control for yourselves. But it does offer some buffering and some shifting of wind-water moves. Okay, zooming in and with appreciations to Danielle for the map on the left there, kind of getting us what we did. Again, looking at just Colgate, there are 3 different reaches that we're going to be talking about. There's the upstream portion in blue. There's the new Colgate Powerhouse there being called out. And then downstream in yellow, we have our impacted reach. And then at the Englebright Reservoir, it goes from sort of water quality impacted to impacted and also anadromous, where anadromous means that we have ocean-going fish. So when we think about Chinook, when we think about steelhead, rainbow trout, that is the portion of the river that they can actually get at. And then you can see the South Yuba coming in there as well. And and again, the water comes through the new Colgate, out of New Ballards Bar Dam. The water pipeline comes out of New Ballards Bar Reservoir here at the top of this map and is piped through a tunnel, through a mountain. That tunnel is about 14 feet in diameter and it's about 5 miles long. We'll see a couple of pictures here in a second. Once the water emerges from that tunnel in rock, it is dropped about 800 feet over roughly a mile downhill to the new Colgate Powerhouse, and the hydraulic head, so head being a measure of sort of volume of water over or above a reference point. That hydraulic head is what spins the turbines at New Colgate. And that's one of 2 ways that we generate electricity. We either spin some copper next to some other copper, or there's solar. But that's how we're generating electricity. We got a lot of water moving real fast downhill, and then we use it to spin a bunch of copper next to some other copper, and we get electricity out of it. In terms of powerhouse, it is not a small powerhouse, about 350 megawatts, which is in the neighborhood of half the size of the power generation at Oroville. So it's not insignificant when it comes to state electricity and state power generation.
So that's 200,000 households?
Yeah, that's what they've been saying. Yeah, a couple 100,000 households for those online. All right, so if we start at the left photo, this is a great view of the penstock. You can see where it's coming out at the top of that photo on the left. That's it coming out of that tunnel, that 5-mile-long tunnel. It drops downhill to the Colgate power plant itself. And you can also see kind of the damage done when that break happened. Top middle photo, pulled from some drone video from Lookout Media. In the red circle itself, you can see the point that failed. It's worth noting that this is new pipe. So over the last kind of 9 months or so, over the summer into fall, Yuba Water Agency was doing preventative maintenance and replaced this section of the penstock pipe. When you think penstock, just think big pipe. They replaced it, and this was the final pressure testing for that new piece of equipment, which it didn't do well in, did not pass the test.
Is that right at the top?
That's right at the very, very top. Okay. Yep, that's the highest point, right where it changes pitch. There were new safety valves, that kind of thing. So from an aging infrastructure standpoint, that's sort of not part of the conversation because they were doing that preventative maintenance, which is not to say that aging infrastructure isn't an issue. Englebright was built in 41, New Ballards Bar was built in 1970, Bowman was 85, and Spalding was 1913. So there's plenty of old infrastructure in the watershed. This is not necessarily that case. So when that failure happened, like I said, they were doing pressure testing. Remember, we've got a 16-foot diameter tunnel that is about 5 miles long. To do pressure testing, that has to be full. And so in total, about 400 acre-feet of water were released out of that, that failure point. That created a massive debris flow, landslide, mudslide event, which is ultimately, you can see in that photo in kind of the lower right and upper right, that's the material that rushed down a hill and rushed kind of through the power plant, right? This created two potential water quality issues. There's whatever happened to be on that concrete pad at the time, plus the dirt itself. There were no fatalities. One of the security workers was kind of blown all the way clear across the river through this, and they're out of the ICU and recovering well. Pretty miraculous in a lot of ways that there weren't actually fatalities. Okay, SYRCL's response, and I'll talk about responses and then kind of what we found. We learned about this happened Friday, February 13th at about 3 p.m. It kind of hit my radar a few hours later. First thing I did was reach out to Willie, the general manager of Yuba Water Agency, and just kind of touch base. Hey, like, what's going on? What, just sort of a, build community. If there's something we can do to help, like, let us know. And then it started thinking, okay, what are we going to do? What's our response? We're concerned about water quality, all of these things. How do we respond? I don't remember, Alicia, if it was that night or the next morning that you and I first spoke. Was it?
In the morning, there was a team started with Tracy and Danielle.
That's right.
And then I think in the morning
we actually connected about, okay, what are we gonna do? How quickly can we get out and start doing the necessary water quality monitoring to get our heads around focusing a lot really on the environmental impacts of this event. The other thing that popped up is Danielle caught that there was a big flow drop in the lower Yuba and that anadromous reach below Englebright Dam. So she prioritized and got out there and put eyes on that. We'll talk about mechanism there here in a little bit. And then testing those volatile organic compounds. So those are good indicators of industrial spills, industrial waste, that kind of thing. So they're sort of environmental from the debris flow, what kind of industrial related water quality impacts are we gonna have, and then what happened with this weird blip in the hydrograph in the lower Yuba. Agencies had a similar response. Their big thing was debris management. A lot of stuff was floating in the river. Also, those volatile organic compounds, and then PCBs, right? So another version of petrochemicals, another way of getting at that. What kind of industrial spill, chemical spill, oil spill do we need to worry about? Their efforts were almost entirely, really entirely focused on Englebright Reservoir. There's not too many miles between where this occurred and the reservoir, and so that's a very convenient place. And they had booms with contractors, Clean Harbors, and Global Diving and Salvage out that morning, kind of at daybreak and really mobilizing before.
How long does it take for that slug of stuff to get down there?
A few days. We will see that, see that here in a little bit. Okay, so results. We're going to start with turbidity. We'll go through all of those things. When we went out, Alicia and I got to spend Valentine's Day together. When we went out, we really focused on all of the different water quality parameters that we do any kind of monitoring for. So turbidity, dissolved oxygen, pH, temperature, conductivity, a lot of different things because we didn't really know what we were going to see, and we didn't know what kinds of environmental signals a given impact might have. So we tested a lot of stuff pretty quickly, especially with dissolved oxygen, pH, some of those things, which could be good indicators of serious industrial contamination or pollution. We didn't see any impact. They were well within normal. And so we stopped monitoring those. Turbidity was the big thing that was very clearly elevated. And so that's what we continued to focus on. That's what this graph really represents. We wanted to contextualize that turbidity, so turbidity being a measure of the kind of cloudiness or dirtiness of a river system or a water body. We on the West Coast have a very clear water bias. Turbidity isn't in and of itself isn't negative. If you're in the Midwest, in the South, on the East Coast, turbid water is very natural, not a problem. That's not the way rivers in the West tend to work, certainly in kind of more alpine granite-based streams. So we focused on turbidity and we contextualized it compared to our bridge ports. We were testing at Rice's Crossing on the North Yuba, a couple of miles downstream of Colgate, and at Bridgeport, because we wanted to have that immediately. Hey, what is an unimpacted? What is natural, given the context of rain, given the context of snow, whatever there is, how different is it than we might expect? So if we look at these first few days of monitoring, this is that big pulse of sediment, and that we call it sort of a sediment plume as it works its way through the reservoir. You can think of like a cloud of very dirty water quickly moving downriver and then slowly moving through this reservoir. We're seeing really high elevated levels of turbidity in these first few days at Rice's Crossing. Thinking, it was a while ago, but thinking about weather, on the 17th is when that leading edge of that big snowstorm showed up, kind of night of the 16th, night of the 17th. And so naturally, when you have a bunch of rain, you're gonna get an increase in turbidity. And so that's why our Bridgeport results in orange also show fairly elevated. The red line is the threshold at which we start to see impacts from salmonids. They start to change behavior, they start to move and behave in kind of different ways. The analogy that I like to use for this is all of our behavior when you think about fire season. Prolonged exposure to a lot of smoke, right? It makes it a little hard to breathe. You're kind of uncomfortable. Maybe you're not sleeping well. You start to behave strangely. And as that continues, man, you're going to try to get out of here. You're going to look for someplace else to go. From an academic standpoint, it's not super well clearly defined exactly what moves when and how. But the consensus is that prolonged exposure to more than 20 NTU tends to modify behavior. That doesn't say anything about impacts to the bugs and things like that that are then buried in all of this sediment. As the storm kind of passes and we move into Film Fest weekend, you can see that at Rice's Crossing and at Bridgeport, levels drop again. We've still got some impacts from the storm, but it's not nearly as pronounced. But that sediment plume is very clearly moved through the reservoir and is now dumping into the anadromous reach below Englebright. As we sort of see here. So again, really high turbidity as that cloud has to move all the way through the system. And if we were taking measurements at the feather, a couple of days later, I don't know, the 3rd, 4th, we probably saw it hit the feather as well. Worth, noting a couple of things, especially during Fest. This is river monitors, river monitor volunteers. Kyle got out a couple of times. That kind of rapid response volunteer network is really important, so I want to give them credit for helping and getting out the kind of second half of the monitoring, and also just appreciate that we've got 20 years of data, and so when we're talking to agencies about, it's normal, so we stopped monitoring, and they always kind of go, well, how do you know? It's like, well, 25 years of data from around the watershed. Like we know what's normal. We have a really good baseline for that. So the next thing that we sampled was the volatile organic compounds. You can see red dots there at Rice's Crossing. We took samples a couple of times, 2 days at sort of this upstream location and downstream location. This is really trying to confirm. We know that CDFW had this big, oiled wildlife response. YWA was doing sampling, and trust but verify, right? There was no sense that they were going to be doing anything untoward or trying to hide information, and it's nice to confirm. Which we did. From our samples, there were small results, small volumes of toluene, which is kind of a solvent used in glues and adhesives and that kind of thing, but very, very minor detections at both sites from the 19th, but nothing concerning, and it confirmed the CDFW that, at least from kind of surface water and monitoring and testing that we have thus far, industrial pollutants are not an issue at this site, which is really encouraging. So the final thing, and I kind of alluded to it a little bit, is the fish stranding, and I think this is a big one in my mind, and far and away the most dramatic and damaging impact of this event. So a little bit of context for how this system works. So the new Colgate Powerhouse and the 2 power outlets at Englebright Reservoir are operated jointly from a control station at Colgate. So even though the Army Corps of Engineers owns the dam at Englebright Reservoir, the 2 powerhouses, called Narrows 1 and Narrows 2, are controlled by and managed by Yuba Water Agency. All of that management happens from New Colgate. There are multiple backups, emergency procedures, that kind of thing, and people at the new Colgate control station, so that when there is a power blip at Colgate, which happens, there are people and processes to make sure that nothing happens at Englebright, that flows don't change at Englebright. In this instance, those people and those processes were evacuating, right? There is a muddy torrent of dirt ripping downhill. People are scrambling. Machinery is shorting. All of those fail-safes failed, didn't function properly, and the on-site fail-safes at Narrows 1 and Narrows 2, one of them worked properly, the other one didn't and turned off. The default is close, not open. And that is what caused this blip. So you can see the stream gauge, these are hydrographs discharged through time. You can see a very, very steady, just below Englebright, 1,400 cubic feet per second. It turns off. We lose an entire tube. Narrows 2 tube closes. And we're left with about 560 cubic feet per second for close to 2 hours before it turns back on. This was a big red flag and is what generated the fish stranding. So not a water quality issue, but all of those juvenile fish that spend time in and among the rocks on the banks were left high and dry for a couple hours. Generally, rivers fluctuate very, very slowly. From a policy standpoint, there's all kinds of rules around ramping rates and how slowly or quickly you can kind of open the spigot on a dam or turn the spigot down so that biology picks up on that changing water level and moves to deeper water. This incident happened way too fast for that and resulted in huge take. It was, again, Danielle saw the blip on the hydrograph and prioritized going out and putting eyes on the ground. And the only reason that anybody has any idea of the endangered species take associated with this incident is because of SYRCL and Danielle. It was not on anybody's reservoir. It was not on anybody's radar. It would have been completely unknown. Even the next morning, 18 hours later, going down there with flows already having been back at kind of normal levels overnight, a lot of the fish were starting to get beat up, and it was hours later that it was gone. They were washed out, they were disintegrated on the rocks. And so that's a really important part of this story, that quick responsiveness and just smart science staff that know what to look for saved and made sure that this was documented. And I think going forward, this is going to be it already is a big part of the story. True counts of mortality are, impossible. If we extrapolate what Danielle and then Jack, who happened to be fishing downstream, sort of saw and documented with photos, and we extrapolate that out across the Yuba, thousands to tens of thousands of spring fall run Chinook, and Omicus steelhead rainbow trout died during this kind of 2-hour event. Yeah, which is tough. It's tough. But whatever, for a species that used to have 300,000 fish in the river, and we're thrilled this year that we saw 10,000 adults, it doesn't take much for it to be meaningful. So kind of moving forward, thinking about what's next, starting with SYRCL, trash pickup is high priority, trying to figure out how to do a focused cleanup from Rice's Crossing up. Anything that was floating in Englebright Reservoir was collected and is gone, but there's a lot of stuff washed up on shore on the banks because there was this flood surge with this failure. And so figuring out a way to do that is a pretty high priority.
All those parked cars get blown out, or did they stay on the shore? There were a lot of parked cars in that first photo.
We don't know. So when you think about...
Like 30 cars and you don't know what happened to them.
We did fly the drone, we didn't see them.
We didn't see anything in the river flying the drone, but we didn't get all the way up. But that is a question when we
Evacuated out, or they might have gotten washed in the river.
when we think about long-term impacts. That's a big question that I have. Is if you think from a mechanism standpoint, it's an avalanche of mud, and so what's going to happen is that leading edge is going to knock stuff off that concrete deck into the river, and then everything behind it is going to bury it. And so I think that stuff is going to be popping out of that mud until that sort of alluvial fan until it's gone, or they dig it all out.
As flows go down.
Yeah, as flows go down, as flows come up. Another big one is long-term ecosystem impacts. I talked a little bit about turbidity and salmonids and kind of that relationship. But you can see my sort of rather aggressive blue arrows there are pointing to a lot of sediment, right? A lot of this fine dirt, the silts and clays, floats, especially when there's a lot of water moving and then gets deposited on the bank. And so I have submitted a grant. I'm hoping to get a little bit of quick funding to study the impact of being buried in sediment on benthic macroinvertebrates, the bugs, the kind of bottom of the food chain in a freestone river like that, because that's the kind of impact that is not necessarily direct, but all of a sudden that's the bottom of the food chain. And so there will likely be impacts there. To the point about buried material from that initial impact, continuing to pay close attention and doing a lot of storm monitoring and storm tracking, including potentially coming out and going back out and doing some of those VOC samples, I think will be really important. And then just debris tracking, and I think this is another place where citizen science, volunteer opportunities may exist, because there likely will be stuff that continues to kind of get eroded out from this debris flow. And tracking that and monitoring that and understanding kind of what that is and what the nature of those impacts are. From a water agency standpoint, new Colgate power generation, selling power from new Colgate to the grid, represents about 80% of Yuba Water Agency's budget. So that's a lot for that water agency. There's no impact on flood control, but that doesn't mean that there aren't challenges to flood control and operation while they work to rebuild and repair. At New Bullard's Bar, there are two different ways that they can get water out of that reservoir. One of them is to spill over the top by design, and there is a low outlet. So the low outlet, the low pipe, has a capacity of 3,500 CFS, cubic feet per second. But as you go through the licensing documents, you learn that they only ever release 1,250 CFS out of that outlet, because anything more than that starts to make it shake violently. So they're pretty limited in their ability to manage flows coming out of New Bullard's Bar, which has the potential to have impacts on required minimum flows downstream. They're on the hook for downstream flows in the anadromous reach. Given the water year type, so how dry or wet it is, what month it is, there are minimum flow requirements that they have to hit. Based on the water year that we're having this year, I wouldn't be surprised if all 1,250 CFS has to stay in the river for environmental purposes, which means they also have a real problem delivering water to the irrigators and south of Delta uses. That is the other 20% of their revenue stream. So I do not envy the position that Willie and YWA are in right now. It is a tough picture. They've got some great reserves, and it's going to be a long road to financial recovery for the water agency as well.